If you've been following track, welcome back. If you're coming into the track, welcome. The track is the Drug Development Future Science, Policy, Partnership, and Economics. And this session is Patients and Caregivers Shaping Clinical Drug Development. This is live streamed. Remember to use, if you want, the mobile app to ask questions. We'll do Q&A at the end of at the end of all the speakers, and be able to answer questions from that. As patients and communities find themselves more integrated into the drug development process, designing a clinical trial with the patients in mind while adhering to the drug development process can be... Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. I'll start this part again. So you got the whole point to thank our sponsors. And so as patients and communities find themselves more integrated into the drug development process, designing a clinical trial with the patients in mind while adhering to the drug development process and regulatory processes, it can be very complex. It's important to work with industry, regulatory agencies to help have a successful outcome of the trial. Our speakers today will share their expertise and knowledge around this topic. And again, the session is Patients and Caregivers Shaping Clinical Drug Development. Let's welcome Neena Nizar, founder and executive director of the Janssen Foundation, James Valentine, associate at Hyman Phelps and McNamara, and Alison Skrinar, vice president of clinical outcomes research and evaluation at Ultragenyx Pharmaceuticals.
Good morning. It's great to be with you all. As was just said, I'm James Valentine. I'm an associate attorney at a food and drug law firm in Washington, D.C., Hyman Phelps and McNamara, where I work with both drug developers and patient advocacy groups to help advance programs through development and ultimately with the goal of FDA approval. But before that, I was at FDA, not as an attorney, but as a patient liaison, working for 6 years to help incorporate the patient voice into FDA decision making. And so because of my background, we've divided up our session in our 3 talks to give you 3 different perspectives. And I'll be really focusing on the regulatory perspective, where the patient voice fits into drug development and drug approval decisions. And then you'll be hearing the patient perspective and industry perspective on this topic. So in my talk, I have 2 main overall topics that I am going to be speaking to. One, I'm going to lay a little bit of the foundation for the role of the patient voice. And then I'm going to also give you an overview of different FDA programs that are available for incorporating the patient voice, as well as an example in a rare disease. So the role of the patient voice in regulatory decision making, this has been something at the Food and Drug Administration that has been going on for quite some time here. You see the timeline here of different types of patient engagement activities, some of which I'll be talking a little bit more about later. But what I think is important here is, even though patient centricity has certainly become more at the forefront in recent years, and the culture has changed both in industry and at the FDA to make the patient more front and center, this has been something that has been happening since the 1980s, and really to the credit of patient activists and advocates who demanded to have a voice at the table, starting with the HIV/AIDS activists who essentially shut down FDA for a day when they showed up, surrounded the FDA building, and demanded to be heard. So this has not only been something that FDA has done itself, but for the first time after over 100 years of there being drug laws in this country, that the patient voice has made it into the law. And one of the ways that this has happened is through the 21st Century Cures Act, which was signed into law in December of 2016, which for the first time requires FDA, when it makes approval decisions, to be transparent and let the world know what information about patients' experiences it had when conducting its review. So when thinking about the role of the patient voice at FDA, there's two primary ways that patients and caregivers can contribute to regulatory decision-making. One is in a product-specific manner, and there's a number of programs that allow individual patients as well as patient communities to weigh in both during development and during the time of approval decisions to help FDA understand the patient perspective. That includes the FDA Patient Representative Program, providing patient preferences and experiences measured within a particular drug development program, as well as open public hearings that occur at FDA advisory committees, which are convened when FDA is reviewing a product and wants to seek external expert input on issues around review and approval. The patient voice can also be very valuable, not just in the context of a particular program, but in setting the context for a condition across any and all programs that might exist. And so that, in this context, patient-focused drug development meetings help bring patient communities together with FDA to share their collective experiences and preferences. There's also FDA listening sessions, qualitative and quantitative different methods like surveys, as well as participating in different FDA meetings and workshops. So it's important, I think, to understand where it is that the patient voice actually does plug in to FDA decisions when they're thinking through the different considerations that they have to look at and weigh when deciding whether to approve a drug. And so the FDA approval decision, they're a scientific agency, so you might say, well, isn't this all? The science will speak to whether the drug should be approved. And the answer is yes and no. So when approving a new drug, FDA has to make a determination that the benefits of the drug outweigh the risks of that drug for its intended use, for the particular disease or condition or specific patient population that it's been studied in. And so that's the scientific determination. FDA has to look at the results from data, determine what are the benefits, what can we glean and feel that we can rely upon for benefit, but also the same for risks. So then once they have made their scientific judgments of what are benefits and what are risks, they have to do a trade-off. This is an inherently subjective value judgment of whether a particular patient community would accept a certain amount of benefit in trade-off for a certain amount of risk from a product. And so where is it that FDA should be calibrating its values about how much risk a patient population should tolerate? Well, the answer, and FDA has acknowledged this, is from those who are living with the disease, who are experts in their own condition. And so many of the different FDA programs are designed to help FDA in that subjective value judgment of weighing benefits and risks. I think we hopefully just temporarily lost the slides. Yep. And so FDA has described this as setting the therapeutic context for benefit-risk decision-making, and has thought hard about this and says there's really two categories of information of the patient experience that universally can help FDA in making those benefit-risk decisions. And one is understanding the burdens of the disease and the impact on patients' daily lives. If you don't know how much a particular symptom or health effect is actually translating to impacts on patients' lives, you don't know how important some amount of benefit from a drug might be. And then similarly, the FDA said we also need to understand patients' perspectives on the adequacy of available treatments. Things are going to be out there, whether it be drugs or other approaches, medical procedures, lifestyle modifications, diet, exercise, all of these different things impact patients' ability to overcome or manage those burdens of their disease. And so it's up to patients to help us define what it is they can manage and what it is left that they still need help with, help define their unmet medical need. And so that is important for informing benefit risk decisions. But importantly, the patient voice doesn't only plug into FDA decision-making at the end when they're weighing benefits and risks. There's many inputs early on. I'm going to speak to one of them, which is the utility of the patient voice in picking the things that are measured in clinical trials, the things that are actually capturing benefit, clinically meaningful benefit, what actually matters to patients. And so these types of measures are called clinical outcome assessments. And these are measures of how a patient either feels or functions. These things can be, probably the most typical people are familiar with are performance measures, things that can be measured in a clinic, like a 6-minute walk test. How far can someone walk in a 6-minute time period? They can be clinician reported outcomes, things that a clinician observes, observer reported, something that, for example, a caregiver observes, or patient reported, what the patient actually is experiencing in terms of how they feel or how they function. Clinical outcomes assessments don't include measures of survival or biomarkers, things that are more direct measures of a lab value, imaging, something that's not actually how a patient is feeling or functioning. And so these are the types of outcomes that FDA looks to support approvals when they're weighing in on the design of clinical trials. So you need to make sure you're measuring the right things from the outset. And so there's a few important decisions around clinical outcome assessments that the patient perspective can really inform. One is, what are the right things to measure? We kind of refer to this in the industry as what are the right concepts of interest. But it's really, what are the aspects of the disease that are the treatment goals that we're trying to impact. Once we've identified those, we're trying to understand what are the right opportunities to measure something. Is it something that we can measure in the clinic when the patient comes in for a visit, every few months? Or is it something that's better measured on a mobile app reported by the patient on a daily or weekly basis? And then ultimately, once we've collected that data using these tools, what amount of change do we need to see that would be considered clinically meaningful? So with that background, sorry for the technical difficulties, I want to just introduce briefly some of the different FDA patient engagement programs that exist, which are designed to help FDA learn from you, patients and caregivers, again, who are experts in your conditions. You know the disease or condition in your day-to-day life more than the medical literature ever could cover, more than even a key opinion leader, research scientist, research clinician would know. They see you when you come in, again, to your visits, but they don't see you every other day in your life, which is where all of the burdens are actually experienced. And so FDA has come up with a number of ways to learn from you directly. So the first program I want to mention is one of the longest standing programs, which is the Patient Representative Program, which began in the 90s. In this role, patients and caregivers have an opportunity to participate both in advisory committees and as consultants to review divisions, essentially serving as a consultant to the FDA. So in this capacity, a patient or a caregiver can apply, be recruited, be trained to be able to be called upon either as FDA is thinking through a development program and wants to essentially bring in a patient voice as an extension of their review team, or at the time of an advisory committee meeting where they're convening that panel of experts. And they, in addition to hearing, getting expert input from clinicians and from biostatisticians and, toxicologists, pharmacologists, they view the patient as an equal voice, an equal type of expertise. And so FDA recruits, has approximately 200 different patient representatives as part of this program. Given comorbidities that these patients represent over 300 different conditions, and they're called upon about, collectively 60 times a year to help FDA think through different regulatory decisions. So another opportunity is listening sessions, and this was one of those opportunities that is not product specific. So these are opportunities for patient organizations to request essentially a one-time meeting with FDA to discuss the particular disease and treatment burden. The scope of the meeting is really defined by the organization requesting it. It can be broad or narrow, and it can be broad in terms of focusing on different types of medical products. You might want to make sure that whether it's a reviewer that's looking at drugs, or a reviewer that's looking at biologics like cell or gene therapies, or reviewers that are looking at medical devices have input, or maybe depending on your focus, maybe you do really just want to meet with one of those parts of FDA. And so the patient affairs staff at FDA administers this program, and there's a link that gives information on how you can actually request these types of listening sessions. So a program that I'm very proud of to had the opportunity to work and help get into the Prescription Drug User Fee Act back in 2012 is the Patient Focused Drug Development Initiative, or PFDD. And this was a program that really, I think was a transition point for the agency where when I was still there, we recognized that we needed a way to more systematically engage with patient communities. We were often, we were waiting for patient communities to come to us and to, raise issues to us. And the only tools that we had were things like listening sessions or patient representatives, which brought just one or a few patients to share their voices. And so we wanted a more systematic way to get the broader patient voice in front of the FDA and to get to learn from a larger number, more representative collection of patients and caregivers. And so, we created this patient-focused drug development commitment as part of the 5th reauthorization of PDUFA, and FDA committed to host at least 20 meetings in different disease areas, meetings that bring patients and caregivers in the room and on via a live webcast to FDA, and try to address these different issues that I talked about of understanding what is the severity and burden of disease, what are the unmet medical needs, and FDA went above and beyond in its commitment, hosting 26 of these meetings, which were very, very successful. Each of these meetings ultimately resulted in a Voice of the Patient report that summarized the meeting using heavily words from those that were in attendance, quotes from patients and caregivers. These meetings were so successful, and with 7,000 plus known rare diseases, just rare diseases alone, there were many, many communities that were requesting to have these types of meetings. FDA knew it itself couldn't keep up with the demand. And so they devised a way, the externally led patient-focused drug development meeting, as a way for patient communities to submit a letter of intent and request to be able to put on one of these meetings themselves, take on some of the burden of organizing, planning, and putting on these meetings. And FDA would still attend and be in listening mode and learning mode, just like they were at the FDA meetings. But this would allow FDA to participate in potentially more of these meetings than it could if FDA was put in the position of having to run them themselves. And so, really this was kind of a passing of the torch, and it has been quite a popular program. I think now of these externally led meetings, there's now been more externally led meetings than the original FDA-led ones. And I don't expect you to be able to read all of the different diseases that are listed here, but here's at least my tracker of all of them. There's no one public calendar. But if you go down that left column, you'll see that most of these are in rare diseases. There's such a demand from patient communities and an interest from regulators in learning about rare diseases where the need to learn from patients is even greater than in more prevalent conditions. There's less research done, there's less known. And so FDA acknowledges that the rare disease patient voice is really critical. And so I've been truly honored to have a role in helping now in private practice work with patient communities in planning and actually moderating a fair number of these meetings. So in these meetings and through a number of these different programs that I've been talking about, there's important key questions that I've been alluding to that FDA wants to know. And so I just provided here these questions so you could see really these are the things that FDA wants you to help them answer. And it almost doesn't matter what the form is. A PFDD meeting is one way, it's great, you're there, you have that personal connection and bond of being there face-to-face. But whether you're doing it through a survey or a patient-focused drug development meeting or any other type of activity, these are the things that FDA wants to help have answered to inform that therapeutic context, those key decision points around picking, planning clinical trial designs or making benefit-risk decisions. And so here, the first set, looking at learning more about the burden of the condition itself, FDA wants to not just know, what are all of the different symptoms or health effects or impacts of a disease, but actually which ones are having the greatest impact on your life. They want to know kind of relative weight of these things from the patient perspective. And they want to know not just what symptoms are most burdensome, but what are the other effects on your life? What activities are limited or restricted because of your condition? Things that are important to you that maybe you can't do or can't do as fully. They want to know also about how these different impacts vary, whether it be day to day, week to week, month to month, or maybe over the course of a progression of a disease over the years. And then, related, not everything is a day-to-day impact. And so they want to know about your worries as well, your worries for the future with your condition, and maybe things that you haven't yet experienced but might be on the horizon, the things that worry you about what might come next. And then building on that, once they have this understanding of the condition and the burden, they want to know how well your current treatment options are helping manage those impacts. And so they want to know what it is you're using, what it is you're doing in your daily life, how well those things are helping manage or treat those burdens and symptoms that most impact you. They want to know not only how well things are working, but what are the trade-offs that you've had to accept, whether it be side effects, whether it be burden of the actual treatment itself. And that collectively helps them understand what it is that needs to be addressed. And then ultimately looking towards the future, what it is you want from a future therapy. All of this is summarized in a Voice of the Patient report, which actually helps give FDA information on benefit and risks and summarizes all of that. And just one quick example on this, the impact that this can have. This is an example in a rare disease, epidermolysis bullosa, a rare genetic condition that essentially causes chronic wounds to exist all over patients' bodies, painful, itching, ever-present wounds. And so this was a review division within the FDA that didn't previously know this disease well. And like in many diseases, when you don't know it well, you look for analogs for other diseases that might help inform how you review it in the absence of knowing the particular disease. And so here, FDA had previously looked to burn wounds and what they required for burn wounds, which was complete closure of wounds in order to have a meaningful result for patients. But when FDA heard from EB patients at their externally led PFDD meeting, you see here the quote from the director of the review division of the dermatology division, Dr. Kendall Marcus. It says, "No one knows this disease better than you all do. What can we do to increase the chances of a trial being able to demonstrate success if the product works? How can we change these trials? What can we do to increase the chances of success?" I think that's something that we all need to think about and go home to think about, and we'll certainly be putting some thought into it. And so FDA, followed up on that promise, that commitment, and just a couple months after that meeting, came out with a guidance document for industry on developing drugs for EB. And when they talked about what outcomes you needed, what endpoints, they didn't say you needed 100% wound closure anymore. They said that the magnitude of change that is going to need to be seen is something that we need to consider and talk about and come in and propose that to us. And so they changed their paradigm because they learned from patients. And so I just want to thank you all for sticking through this foundational talk, and I'm really excited to pass this off to Neena, who's going to give a case study on her experience navigating many of these topics and issues. That's forward now.
Is it working? Okay. So yeah, just to go over what James said, I'm going to be giving you like a case study of what we did as an organization and how we dealt or collaborated with the FDA and the other regulatory, as well as industry in getting to where we are today. So we're with the Janssen's Foundation, and so when I started thinking about what is the timeline, or what, we have timelines that are put forth for clinical trial development, the 3 phases, and then we have industry timelines, but I really wanted a patient-centric timeline. So what do new patients just finding out that they have a rare disease or starting to see symptoms, what do we do and what's our timeline? So that's what I tried to put together. And so the first real thing is finding a diagnosis. And in my case, if you were there yesterday, it took me 32 years to get a diagnosis. But the average is 4 to 8 years. And in that time, you would have seen 7 to 8 physicians. I must have seen about 50 to 60 different physicians when I had my boys. Once you have a diagnosis, what do we do next? We learn. We learn as much as we can about our disease. We are the experts, yes, but we also need to collaborate with people who are around us who probably know more or know it from different angles. So we really need a team. As they were saying in the morning, we need that army. The next step is really finding a researcher. Once you find a researcher, it's like striking gold. You have your, the A team that you put together. And then very important is to publish. Once you find your researcher and you get a good collaboration going, you have to publish. And I think there's so many tracks about this, how to start joining a foundation. So if there are foundations already out there, please join them. If not, start a new one. If there is a foundation, please don't go ahead and start another one because it wastes resources and time. You really need to be able to collaborate. And then, of course, the registry, setting up a registry, putting together a natural history study, dealing with the FDA, and then, of course, pharma. And then you're really on your way to a drug. Sounds really good. But for us, when we went through several misdiagnoses before we actually got a diagnosis. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of backstory because after the presentation, a lot of people asked me, please tell us about how you did what you did. And so I said, it's in my slides, come and watch. So here it is. So Christmas 2009, my son was born. He was 9 pounds. Don't ask me how I did that, but I did. He was really healthy. We had no signs of disease, and we thought, yes, he's fine. And but by the time I had my second son in 2010, my first son started regressing when my second son was in the womb, and they had all these signs and symptoms that I had no idea because now it turns out I'm mosaic, and so I didn't manifest the same symptoms. So we did find a diagnosis because one doctor was able to see one slide and say, I know what you have. So those of you in the room without a diagnosis, don't give up hope. Somebody out there knows what you have. It's just a matter of finding him or her. Let's try this. This is not working. Okay. So when we did get a diagnosis, we hit this really big name, Janssen's metaphyseal chondrodysplasia. I'm like, how can we have such a big name? We're such little people. And then it turns out that it wasn't just a bone condition, and it wasn't just debilitating physically, but it also affected the kidneys. And we started seeing, don't Google the images of your disease as you are always told. But when we did Google it, we turned up with really horrible images. But I knew from my personal experience that, come on, it can't be that bad. I'm alive. And then, so we went in search of Dr. Jupiter. He was the only one who had published one article that we were able to access. But he had been researching it for 20 years but never met a patient. And when I mean researching it, he'd been doing a lot of bone studies, and Jansen's was an interest because it was such an anomaly in the world of skeletal bone. And so we met in 2016, and then he met my boys a couple of months later, and I think the whole trajectory of his department changed because they did not know that the disease caused pain. They did not know that patients were in a wheelchair. They knew it at the molecular level, but to be able to discuss some of those things with them was really important. In 2017, we formed the foundation. So, and in beginning of 2017, we started accelerating because, I wasted 32 years. So we started moving really quickly, got together a paper, and we published a first real study documenting the nature of the disease in myself and my two boys. And this was the paper that actually got picked up by the NIH for an R01 grant that gave us the foundation to start preclinical data collection and study. And then also, all the time when we're doing this timeline, we have to still live and manage the disease. And so when they talk about, your disease not having an impact, I'm like, look at these slides. There is an impact if we can bring a treatment to these children. So, okay, so so then, of course, we went around finding others around the world to see whether there were others, and we found 8. And God, this is so embarrassing, but okay. All right, and then we did, of course, find our research team, and that's really just the first part. We published, we got the team excited, we were able to give data of ourselves, make mice models. It is not working. And so we were able to make mice models at the end of after we got the R01 grant, and a ligand was introduced in the lab that would increase the amount of bone development or growth, and it was extremely phenomenal. It changed everything for us, and very recently, with this information, we approached FDA. And we said, we have all this data, we've published, tell us what we need to do next. And a couple of things to people in the room. First off, believe it's possible, that you can do this, that it's not very hard, that the website is a must read. So you must read the FDA website. Don't just say, tell me what the FDA is about. Read it. It does have documents there. And then find your disease area. That's very important. Sometimes we fall under different areas, and you have to find out the area you can fall under. You can call them. They're very responsive. They're excellent. And as James was talking about, the Patient Engagement Collaborative, they're doing so much more of that. And very, very important, find the right forms when you're filling out your paperwork, because most of the time we waste time with the wrong forms. And also, when we are working with them, organize your paperwork in the sense that when we're talking about endpoints, what is the ultimate measurable goal or evidence that you're going to look for? What is that patient-relevant outcome? For us, it has been, we want to reduce the number of surgical interventions. We want to give them better bone growth, and we want to be able to reduce pain. So we had 3 patient outcomes. And then, of course, remember that the FDA is looking for efficacy and safety, and document every stage. So as an organization, it's great to have your registry or your natural history study, but as a foundation leader, document. Just keep documenting of your kid. I was in a room the other day with Megan, and Megan said, she has an app where she takes videos of all her seizures of her daughter, and that is submissible data. So, even if you're taking pictures every day, that works too. So document every step, and then also provide a reference of evaluation. So if you're saying my child has improved, in what way has she improved, or he improved? So from 5 months ago to what is she doing now that she didn't do before? And we have to also remember that they're going to look for preclinical data in vitro and in animal studies, and we need to know what's the maximum or dose that we can establish safety. And so that's also important. And then remember risk evaluation and mitigation. So they are going to think about how are we going to make sure that there's more benefit than risk. And then as a leader, you also want to keep in mind when this does go to trial that at any time the trial can be stopped if you don't have good guidelines or clinical practice. So even if you are involved in everything and they are saying, well, it's okay, no, you still have to be actively engaged to make sure that the trial doesn't derail. So for us, we've been successful in that we got the R01 in 2017. And we approached the FDA in the beginning of 2018, and it was a phenomenal meeting because it gave us real tangible outcomes as to what we were lacking in our document and what we needed to work on. And then very ironically, we started the patient registry. Even though we had the patients, we did it after that. And then we started the natural history study after that. Even though we had it all on paper, we collated and put it together. And then very, very recently, our biggest success has been how do we move that now, and we did not have a pharma partner. We're working on it today, though, but but we did all this without a pharma partner and with less than $10,000. I did not raise a single. I did not go fundraising because first off, I just couldn't. There were 3 people in the patient group. There were me, myself, and my 2 boys. I'd be literally hounding my family and friends to keep donating to a GoFundMe page until they blocked me on Facebook. So it wasn't going to work. So I really knew that we have enough resources around. The NIH is a great resource. And if you have strong scientific data, you should approach them and say, hey, will you take a look at my data? Does it look promising? Which disease area can we fall under? And PJ Brooks from the NIH is here, and he's excellent. And he's a great resource as well. So we got the NIH TRND funding, and that is the translational research for rare and neglected diseases like ours that won't receive funding from anyone else because our disease is not impactful enough. So we got this funding, and it is now going to take us to the efficacy and the NDA trial, and then to have a new investigational drug treatment available for the children. We have, disclaimer, we have not worked with industry yet, but my first taste of industry was like, well, no one's going to be interested in 8 patients. But the landscape is changing. And very interestingly, our disease is now opening up pathways. We are now in talks with the NIH to take our disease and to see how our cells can be used in stem cell research, because it's going to open up a whole gamut of treatments for osteoporosis and osteoarthritis, because the regulators are the same in our disease. So it's really fascinating. And I told somebody yesterday, which is the stupidest thing to say, but it's the greatest time to have a rare disease because there's so much happening. And with the Chan Zuckerberg movement moving into the rare disease space, it really gives everybody a lift that there's going to be more funding, there's going to be more support systems available. But when we do work with industry, one of the things that we as patients can do is clarity of purpose. Like, they want to know what is our purpose in working with them, what is our end goal. If we have that very clearly stated, it's easier to work with them. What are our asks? When you have a presentation, you get the kid, when your son comes to you and say, okay, come on, tell me what you want in like less than 10 seconds. That's what we need to be able to do. So, and then transparency. We need to be able to build trust through very clear objectives, and we need to be able to externally scrutinize what we're doing all the time so that we remain ethical and we remain true to our children. And independence. As patient organizations working with industry, we must also have the independence to make decisions for our patient groups and to be respected for that. And that respect and collaboration is really what's going to take us to the next step. So with that, I want to leave you with this thought that, I always say, we were small when we started out, but, never doubted that we can change things. Maybe not the world, but we'll change our world with our treatment. And so I'm going to leave you with that. If I can change it, the slide.
We're back to. Okay, there we go. So what I wanted to do was kind of build on what James and Neena had just lined up for you, and that's really talking about, back to Neena's comment about there never being, there's never been a better time to have a rare disease. And I think that from personal experience, I've been in rare disease drug development for 20 years. And I could not have envisioned all of the things that are going on now, how the landscape has changed. Those are all things that would have made my job so much easier, with the goal always being to bring drugs to market as safely and quickly as possible. For those with rare diseases. So the door is open for creativity, thinking openly, collaborating with FDA, and actually being able to collaborate with patients. When I came into industry, there was just this huge wall. And industry knew that we needed to learn about the diseases. We were almost put in a position where we couldn't talk to patients, we couldn't talk to patient organizations. And now that we have ways, and it's actually not only encouraged, but it's pretty much a given that you have to do this, we have an opportunity to do something that I have always wanted to do, which is let the patient design the clinical trial. So thanks to all the efforts of policymakers and patient groups and the FDA, we're now going toward patient-focused drug development where we actually can work from the very beginning, from when a drug comes from the bench side into the clinic. We can start thinking about what a clinically meaningful change would mean in terms of how it affects a patient's feeling and function. So finally, we're at an era where the patient voice is recognized. And for me, it's always been that the patient is the greatest source of data that you can ever have to design a clinical trial, but how do you get it? So for me to have a roadmap now where it's actually encouraged makes my life so much easier. And frankly, I think it will allow us in industry to bring drugs to market faster. So the approval and adoption, now we're in an era where it actually depends on the patient. So from that perspective, there couldn't be a better place. So the most successful future trials moving forward will be designed by the patient. So as I said before, it's really never too early to start gathering this information. And from all the initiatives that James just discussed, this can be happening now when you don't even have a model. All of the background information that's needed to establish clinical efficacy endpoints that can be validated and make everyone rest assured that any biomarker changes that you see actually translate to clinically meaningful change in the lives of the patient. So all of this work can start now so that when you do have what appears to be a viable treatment in the lab, you're actually going forward and, there will be shorter trials, there will be better trials, and hopefully there'll be fewer trials because you already know how to demonstrate the clinical efficacy of a treatment from the perspective of the patient. So where are we now? Well, the challenges that we've always had in rare disease drug development will still exist. They have existed. There's nothing we can do. The two greatest things from Statistics 101, working against you. We still have that bar of P is less than 0.05. How do we get there? We need large groups of homogeneous patients. That's never going to happen within rare disease. But what do you do about that? You started to see rare disease trials become bigger. So they've opening up their eligibility criteria to increase the number of patients in there. What that also does is increase variability. So then, if you whittle it down and do smaller trials, Then you have the more clinically homogeneous patient population. It's a little harder from an N perspective, but you actually have a way of bridging all the commonalities between these patients and focusing on demonstrating an effect in that thing that these patients have in common. But then when you do that, someone will say, well, how is that generalizable? What does that mean for patients that are more severely affected? What does that mean for patients who are milder in their presentation? And so then you have a generalizability issue. But I would argue that, maybe it's smaller trials, addressing, kind of the spectrum of disease as opposed to putting everybody in one trial that might be better, unless you can find that common ground. What is a clinically meaningful change from the perspective of the patient, and is a patient in a condition to do that in a clinical trial setting? So the goal is really to have a successful clinical trial that then those results can be extrapolated to the broader patient population. So now that we have treatments on the horizon, a lot of new platforms, gene therapy, it really is, from the perspective of a regulator, from the perspective of industry, we have to drive the science as hard as possible. Because there's a lot of people out there trying to develop drugs, but we want to make sure that we develop the best possible drug for rare disease. But in order to do that, it's really the patients that we need data. And we need data from patients. And now we're in an era where we can actually work together, and I can't ask for it directly, but if you're collecting it and providing it, then we can use it to design our clinical trials. So what types of initiatives help foster this? James alluded to that, kind of made the introduction for this. Retrospective medical chart reviews. Every medical chart, every piece of data, every time you go to the doctor's office, that's data. That is data that is useful, because there is a natural history study guidance now, so that if it isn't ethical or feasible to do a placebo-controlled study, that a patient, your data can allow a patient to serve as their own control. In the absence of treatment, in this medical chart, you can see that I was declining or I was not making any progress on this endpoint. And now that I've switched over to treatment, you can see that I'm either improving or I'm stabilizing my function. I am no longer declining. And that is the best way to serve as your own control. And that's going to be increasingly important when you think about disorders that are as rare as what Neena just talked about. You're not going to find an adequate control group. You're not going to be able to have enough power in your clinical trial to even have a control arm. What's the control? You are the control. So getting all that data together. When fundraising takes place, we talked about giving those charts to a vendor who can strip it of all of its identifiers, aggregate it, and say, this is what the patients look like. That's the information from the patient perspective that industry needs to design a trial that's actually going to answer the research question. Pilot studies, so going backwards with the retrospective chart reviews, but also going forward. You can actually get together and test some of those things that we want to know about. Is this the right performance measure? Is this the right observational measure? A clinician-reported measure, a patient-reported outcome measure. If there's something that is meaningful to you, or develop your own. We got together, we had a consensus panel, and these are the things that we find most burdensome. These are the activities of daily living that we require assistance with. These are the things that we're still able to do on our own. That information is hugely helpful, because that is recognizing that the patient is the greatest source of data. So if you say these are our problems, and then a treatment is actually able to allow you to say, wow, here's what we're left with, but here's what we fixed, that's a clinically meaningful change. So you, in essence, a patient group can develop and or validate existing clinical outcome measures. Patient interviews. I think I've always been in rare disease, and so I have a different perspective on it, I think, and it's lovely to see the environment changing, but clinical trials are incredibly hard. for all of the patients and their caregivers, and the lost income and the challenges. So there has to be input from the patient perspective about what specifically the patients will need to make clinical trial participation feasible, and allow us to operationalize it. Do we need sites, that are located in areas that have a jetway so that we can actually get patients on and off of transportation? How far a drive is it to the site? Are there things that patients are taking to manage their disease? If you go into a controlled study that's either a placebo or no treatment, can someone who doesn't have the answer as to whether or not they're developing something that works ask you not to take something that you really feel is helping you? So those are all the things we need to understand. What type, yes, these diseases are unmet medical needs, but we do need to understand what type of palliative care is out there, because to James's presentation, it's very important to know what people are taking and where they perceive a benefit and where they perceive the benefit, what's left over, right? What would a new treatment look like that would help address some of those things that existing measures can't? And then we've also, the eligibility criteria. We want to make sure that patients can participate, that they can perform the outcome measures that we've identified, and that they can stick it out through a trial. And if not, it's not the end of the world, because again, one trial that demonstrates efficacy can be the trial that can get a drug approved, and the goal is to make it available to anyone that needs it. But it may just be that the clinical trial itself is not the best forum to do that for all patients. But if we can do a good trial, then we'll do fewer trials, and we'll do shorter trials, and we'll have trial results that are then, lead to an approval so that the drug is available to anyone that needs it, and that's the goal. So fundraising, grants, use of central IRB and protocol with independent third parties. This can address a lot of the concerns about patient privacy and bias. Industry selected those patients to have this because they think that that's what their drug can change. We don't want that, right? Take all the bias away, get those charts together, and use funding to find a vendor who will aggregate all of that data and develop, whether it's a white paper or a publication, like the one that the Janssen Foundation produced. That's data. That's helpful. And eventually, if the patients do consent to it, that data can then be given to industry to help design a trial. But we do need to have guidelines, figure out how we can all work together to do this. So one of the things that we've talked about is having the three of us develop a white paper that talks about what would a patient group do, what would FDA do, what would it look like from a regulatory perspective, from a patient perspective, and from an industry perspective, because then that could be used as a roadmap and really just outline bring together all of these ideas that we've talked about today. How do I go about going from an N of one, right? One group, one mom and her two kids, to a group that can actually drive clinical drug development. Okay. And with that, hopefully we can take a few questions and have a talk about some of the things that we covered today.
Great. You can use your app to send a question, or anybody in the room.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Eric Hartman. I'm with the Choroideremia Research Foundation, and I just wanted to reiterate the openness that we found from the FDA. Mine is a rare degenerative disease, and we were going to be following the trial of the LCA Luxturna trial, and our eye diseases are completely different. But the FDA was very open to us meeting with the CBER committee that does the review to let them better understand the patient population. So for those of you that are looking towards trials, it's incredibly important that you reach out to them, because sometimes the developers or even the principal investigators may have preconceived notions from things they heard 5, 10 years ago from the FDA. And it's not the going thing. So it was an incredibly important way for us to be able to develop better clinical endpoints. And Neena, there's a rumor going around that I was the blind luggage handler who broke your wheelchair. It was not me. I was here.
I love you, Eric. Yeah, I know you wouldn't do that.
Eric, I just want to respond to that. You know, I think you make an incredibly important point, which is don't assume that anyone knows about your condition. And you were talking about how open FDA was and how much was learned and how there was a movement away from what may have been the assumptions based on old information, limited information. I think the worst thing that you can do is assume that people do know what your condition is about and what the patient experience is. My experience across dozens and dozens and dozens of rare diseases is that is not the case. And that's why I included that epidermolysis bullosa example, where people will look to other things to try to understand a disease. So it's upon you to make sure that they really, truly understand your specific condition.
And also just to add on and to that, so there is the same misconception among researchers as well of being in a position where, oh, you can't develop a drug. You know, that's, you know, it's cute. You're bringing like really cute ideas, but this isn't going to go anywhere. Because there's still of that mindset, and especially a lot of the academia are very interested in publication all the time, that they're wrapped up, and we are missing an important and vital link of the translational science part of this in drug development. And so to be able to, you know, keep telling them, no, you know, things have changed, and, you know, and give them examples of rare diseases that have brought treatments in you know, to market. I think that's a good example as well.
Thank you. I was really struck by the fact that, Alison, what you were mentioning, where, yes, you know, the ideal goal is to find cures for all these diseases. We know that. We also know the incredible expense. However, what you're saying is profound, which is the secondary goal may be to provide treatments that improve quality of life and lower disease burden. And every single patient advocate that I've met today is trying to think about how do I get started? And I think the word that I'm walking away from is data. Build that data set about how the disease is impacting yourself, your child, your family member. That becomes a foundation to build into this incredible success that you've had so far. So thank you.
Also to add on to that, that's a really good point. The fact is, when we're building our natural history study or our registry, there are several different types of registries. You can have like a public health registry, or you can have just a, you know, a genotype registry or a phenotype registry. But if your goal is treatment, you must have a treatment registry, which means start with an endpoint in mind. What do you hope to achieve? How, you know, that disease impact you're talking about? You know, lessen the number of seizures or lessen the number of surgical interventions. So start with that in mind. So treatment registry is a little bit different, and you can go about it that way, and it'll make their job much easier when we give over the data to them.
So in a lot of these diseases, I think that, you know, there's a goal to develop a biomarker. But I would say that if you use all this data and collect it together, you can develop a surrogate marker, one that is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit, because what's in those charts is that link, right? If a biomarker is going to be the thing that gets a drug approved, then it has to be linked to your clinical outcomes. So we want to know if changes in that biomarker are going to lead to changes in patient perception of their health state. That information is in your chart. So you have to be thinking about this from all levels, right? Can I create a database that is going to help the FDA, that's going to help a company say, wow, I think they have something here. I think this is a relatively straight path forward, assuming that a drug works. But all of that legwork while you're looking for a treatment can help. And the other thing that I will say is, any treatment is better than nothing. And when I started off, I was with Genzyme a long time ago when we started working on Pompe disease. And to now, everyone said, oh gosh, what are you doing? That's such a devastating disease. Muscle is just, muscle and neuro, the last bastions of hope. And now so many companies have that in their pipeline. So to be that pioneer, is it the best that it could be? No, but it helped. But what it also helped was encourage other people that there was less risk. There's a market for it. There's patients who are in need. And so you build toward a cure. The first treatment doesn't have to be a cure. It just has to do something. And what that does is put the infrastructure in place for the next product and the next product, and ultimately that cure.
Great. I have a question that has come in. A RO1 NIH grant was secured. What was the role of the foundation in the application process? I believe that's for you, Neena.
It was gruesome. It was hours of filling up paperwork, but from the perspective of the foundation, what was important was those data points that we had, and the fact that we published papers on our disease and the nature of our disease and what we were looking for with this ligand. So, and how the ligand could turn off the receptor, which was overactive in our disease. So yes, we played a crucial role. We have played a role in every single step of this process. We were told by the research team in the beginning that this isn't doable. And just 2 weeks, I think it's been September 4th when we got the second NIH TR&D grant. And just as Alison said, we had packaged it so tightly that all they could tell us was, this is very doable. This is very doable. And it was just very clear cut. So we had an endpoint in mind, and we were able to do that. And the NIH R01 grant is not hard. Even if you don't get it the first time, don't fret. You can apply again. And they give you such good feedback as to where and what points are missing, and that you can work on those.
Great. Just to keep us on time, I'd like to say thank you to the speakers, if we can give them a round of applause. They can answer some questions after the session if you want. Please remember to fill out the survey. Also, the lunch will be provided by Avexis, so thank you to Avexis. And be aware that there's a new program that's on the Rare University that Global Genes has, so you can go on their site for that. Thank you.